pretrial proceedings for Chris Carbert and Anthony Olienick are not yet over. They're going to be on a temporary hiatus, and they're expected to continue on May 24th. There are currently scheduled court dates, which are expected to lead into the trial dates until June 27th, here in the Lethbridge, Alberta courthouse. This is Robert Kraychik reporting for Rebel News. The two defendants, Chris Carbert and Anthony Olienick, are being accused of having conspired to murder RCMP officers. The specific charge is conspiracy to murder. These charges stem from their participation in the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade, which was a demonstration that occurred concurrently with the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, Ontario. The two demonstrations were peaceful. They exhibited civil disobedience, and they were both broadly opposed to this massive governmental apparatus of surveillance and control marketed as a public health measure to reduce transmission of COVID-19. There's a fundraiser for Chris Carbert's defense costs. You can contribute to it by visiting helpchris.ca. Bear in mind that lawyers do not work for free, and they are definitely not cheap. There is still a publication ban over the pretrial proceedings, which restricts my ability to report on the goings-on, the occurrences inside the courtroom. The rationale there is to prevent the dissemination of information to the public, which may prejudice people from whom potential jurors would be selected. So keep in mind that during pretrial proceedings, there are disputes between the Crown and, in this case, the two defense teams over the legitimacy or admissibility or veracity of information that the Crown seeks to submit into the trial as evidentiary exhibits. There can also be disputes over the legality of this information's acquisition. So, to be more specific, if the Crown seeks to introduce particular information as evidence, the defense can challenge its accuracy. They can challenge the, for example, reliability of a witness. They can also challenge the relevancy of a proposed expert, and they can also challenge the legality of acquisition of information. So these disputes are taking place to set the parameters of what information, if any, is permitted to be submitted in the context of this trial by the Crown as evidence. And consider a possibility. If evidence or potential evidence against defendants was acquired unlawfully by the government, this information should not be released to the public for fear that it may prejudice or contaminate the minds of potential jurors who would then be selected to sit in judgment of the two defendants. So until the pretrial comes to an end and the jury is impaneled, we at Rebel News will be unable to report on those specifics. But when the trial comes to a conclusion and the jury has rendered its verdicts, we can then share with you what those disputes entailed. One thing that we can report on, that we can relay from pretrial proceedings following a legal challenge against this publication ban from several news media outlets, is that certain statements attributed to Anthony Olienick that are being used or proposed by the prosecution to be submitted as evidence against him, evidence of his guilt, were obtained by RCMP officers working undercover in the context of the 2022 Coutts blockade and protest, specifically the use of female police officers that were sent to act as if they were like-minded, fellow traveling protesters and demonstrators sharing ideological, political, or philosophical objectives with the protesters. So you folks can consider what that may have looked like. Female police officers being sent to elicit particular behaviors or statements from the defendants. Both defendants, Chris Carbert and Anthony Olienick, when they're brought into the courtroom, they're wearing leg shackles, these sort of metal chains around their ankles. You can hear that metal clanking when they're brought into and out of the courtroom. And as they sort of shuffle their feet because they have an improper gait while wearing these chains, you can't walk properly. Also in the courtroom, they're held in this defendant's box, which is surrounded by this sort of protective plastic, just to give you folks a sense of the visuals and the physical circumstances in which the defendants sit during these courtroom pretrial proceedings. And this is what the jury will see once it's selected. I've been told by people that love and care about Chris Carbert and that have known him for a long time that his physical condition has degraded across his time in remand at the Lethbridge Correctional Center, the LCC. Basically, he has lost muscle and gained body fat. I've also come to understand that the food provided in the LCC is of terrible quality, essentially frozen type meals, and people in remand or other inmates can purchase extra foods at this sort of concession stand, which apparently is only selling hyper-processed junk food like chips and cookies and candy bars, the type of so-called food that destroys your physicality. Combine that with a lack of exposure to sunlight and extremely limited exercise options, and Chris Carbert's physical degradation makes a lot more sense. I'm here in Lethbridge, Alberta, reporting on two trials. The pretrial proceedings for Chris Carbert and Anthony Olienick on the one hand, and the Coots 3 trial on the other hand, which recently arrived at this semi-conclusion given the jury's rendering of guilty verdicts against 3 defendants.
We have to rely on our justice system and on our jury. And our jury is a jury of our peers, and we'll have to accept.
There's a fundraiser for Chris Carbert's defense costs. You can contribute to it by visiting helpchris.ca. Bear in mind that lawyers do not work for free, and they are definitely not cheap.